Typical example is give it a picture and tell me what's in the picture. Now, can you have some fun with that as an 18-year-old? Of course, right? So when I say Python, I mean Python using the tools that are available to build something new, something that you're interested in.
And when you say critical thinking, what is critical thinking, and how does one go about acquiring that as a skill?
Well, the first and most important thing about critical thinking is to distinguish between being marketed to, which is also known as being lied to, and being given the argument on your own. We have, because of social media, which I hold responsible for a lot of ills as well as good things in life, we've sort of gotten used to people just telling us something and believing it because our friends believe it or so forth. And I strongly encourage people to check assertions. So you get people to say all this stuff, and I learned at Google all those years. Somebody says something, I check it on Google. And you then have a question. Do you criticize them and correct them, or do you let it go? But you want to be in the position where somebody makes a statement. Like, did you know that only 10% of Americans have passports, which is a widely viewed but false statement? It's actually higher than that, although it's never high enough, in my view, in America. But that's an example of an assertion that you can just say, is that true, right? There's a long meme about American politicians where the Congress is basically full of criminals. It may be full of one or two, but it's not full of 90. But again, people believe this stuff because it sounds plausible. So if somebody says something plausible, just check it. You have a responsibility before you repeat something to make sure what you're repeating is true. And if you can't distinguish between true and false, I suggest you keep your mouth shut, right? Because you can't run a government, a society, without people operating on basic facts. Like, for example, climate change is real. We can debate over whether it's how to address it, but there's no question the climate is changing. It is a fact. It is a mathematical fact. And how do I know this? And somebody will say, well, how do you know? And I said, because science is about repeatable experiments and also proving things wrong. So let's say I said that climate change is real. And this was the first time it had ever been said, which is not true. Then 100 people would say, that can't be true. I'll see if he's wrong. And then all of a sudden, they'd see I was right and I'd get some big prize, right? So the falsifiability of these assertions is very important. How do you know that science is correct? It's because people are constantly testing it.
And why is this skill of critical thinking so especially important in a world of AI?
Well, partly because AI will allow for perfect misinformation. So let's use an example of TikTok. TikTok can be understood. It's called the bandit algorithm in computer science, in the sense of the Las Vegas one-armed bandits. Do I stay in the bandit machine and I keep on this slot machine, or do I move to another slot machine? And the TikTok algorithm basically can be understood as, I'll keep serving you what you tell me you want, but occasionally I'll give you something from the adjacent area. And it's highly addictive. So what you're seeing with social media, and TikTok is a particularly bad example of this, is people are getting into these rabbit holes where all they see is confirmatory bias. And the ones that are, I mean, if it's fun and entertaining, I don't care. But you'll see, for example, there are plenty of stories where people have ultimately self-harm or suicide because they're already unhappy. And then they start picking up unhappy. And then their whole environment online is people who are unhappy, and it makes them more unhappy because it doesn't have a positive bias. So there's a really good example where, let's say in your case, you're the dad. You're going to watch this as the dad with your kid, and you're going to say, it's not that bad. Let me show you let me give you some good alternatives. Let me get you inspired. Let me get you out of your funk. The algorithms don't do that unless you force them to. It's because the algorithms are fundamentally about optimizing an objective function, literally mathematically maximize some goal that has been trained to.
Attention.
In this case, it's attention. And by the way, part of we have so much outrage is because if you're a CEO, you want to maximize revenue. To maximize revenue, you maximize attention. And the easiest way to maximize attention is to maximize outrage. Did you know? Did you know? Did you know? Right? And by the way, a lot of the stuff is not true. They're fighting over scarce attention. There was a recent article where there's an old quote from 1971 from Herb Simon, an economist at the time at Carnegie Mellon, who said that economists don't understand, but in the future, the scarcity will be about attention. So somebody now, 50 years later, went back and said, I think we're at the point where we've monetized all attention. An article this week, 2.5 hours of videos consumed by young people every day, right? Now, there is a limit to the amount of video you can, because you have to eat and sleep and hang out. But these are significant societal changes that have occurred very, very quickly. When I was young, there was a great debate as to the benefit of television. And, my argument at the time was, well, yes, we did rock and roll and drugs and all of that. And we watched a lot of television, but somehow we grew up okay, right? So it's the same argument now with a different term. Will those kids grow up okay? It's not as obvious because these tools are highly addictive, much more so than television ever was.
Do you think they'll grow up okay?
I personally do because I'm inherently an optimist. I also think that society begins to understand the problems. A typical example is there's an epidemic of harm to teenage girls. Girls, as we know, are more advanced than boys at those below 18. And the girls seem to get hit by social media at 11 and 12 when they're not quite capable of handling the rejection and the emotional stuff. And it's driven, emergency room visits, self-harm, and so forth to record levels. It's well documented. So society is beginning to recognize this. Now, schools won't let kids use their phones when they're in the classroom, which is kind of obvious if you ask me. So developmentally, one of the core questions about the AI revolution is what does it do to the identity of children that are growing up? Your values, your personal values, the way you get up in the morning and think about life is now set. It's highly unlikely that an AI will change your programming, but your child can be significantly reprogrammed. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is what happens when the best friend of your child from birth is a computer. What's it like? Now, by the way, I don't know. We've never done it before. But you're running an experiment on 1 billion people without a control, right? And so we have to stumble through this. So at the end of the day, I'm an optimist because we will adjust society with biases and values to try to keep us on a moral, high ground human life. And so you should be optimistic for that because these kids, when they grow up, they'll live to 100, their lives will be much more prosperous. I hope and I pray that there'll be much less conflict. Certainly their lifespans are longer. The likelihood of them being injured in wars and so forth are much, much lower statistically. It's a good message to kids.
As someone who's led one of the world's biggest tech companies, if you were the CEO of TikTok, what would you do? Because I'm sure that they realize everything you've said is true, but they have this commercial incentive to drive up the addictiveness of that algorithm, which is causing these echo chambers, which is causing the rates of anxiety and depression amongst young girls and young people more generally to increase. What would you do?
So I have talked to them and to the others as well. And I think it's pretty straightforward. There's sort of good revenue and bad revenue. When we were at Google, Larry and Sergey and I, we would have situations where we would improve quality. We would make the product better. And the debate was, do we take that to revenue in the form of more ads, or do we just make the product better? And that was a clear choice. And I arbitrarily decided that we would take 50% to one, 50% to the other, because I thought they were both important. So, and the founders, of course, were very supportive. So Google became more moral and also made more money, right? All of there's plenty of bad stuff on Google, but it's not on the first page. That was the key thing. The alternative model would be to say, let's maximize revenue. We'll put all the really bad stuff, the lies and the cheating and the deceiving and so forth that draws you in and will drive you insane. And we might have made more money, but first it was the wrong thing to do. But more importantly, it's not sustainable. There's a law called Gresham's Law. It's a verbal law, obviously, where bad speech drives out good speech. And what you're seeing in online communities, which have always been present with bullying and this kind of stuff. Now you've got crazy people, in my view, who are building bots that are lying, right? Misinformation. Now, why do you do that? You've got, and there was a hurricane in Florida, and people are in serious trouble. And you, sitting in the comfort of your home somewhere else, are busy trying to make their lives more difficult. What's wrong with you? Like, let them get rescued. Human life is important. But there's something about the human psychology where people talk about, there's a German word called Schadenfreude. There's a bunch of things like this that we have to address. I want social media and the online world to represent the best of humanity: hope, excitement, optimism, creativity, invention, solving new problems, as opposed to the worst. And I think that is achievable.
You arrived at Google at 46 years old, 2001?
2001.
2001. You had a very extensive career before then, working for a bunch of really interesting companies. Sun Microsystems is one that I know very well. You've worked with Xerox in California as well. Bell Labs was your first sort of real job, I guess, at 20 years old. First sort of big tech job. What did you learn in this journey of your life about what it is to build a great company and what value is as it relates to being an entrepreneur and people in teams? Like, if there were like a set of first principles that everyone should be thinking about when it comes to doing something great and building something great, what are those like first principles?
So the first rule I've learned is that you need a truly brilliant person to build a really brilliant product. And that is not me. I work with them. So find someone who's just smarter than you, more clever than you, moves faster than you, changes the world, is better spoken, more handsome, more beautiful, whatever it is that you're optimizing, and ally yourself with them. Because they're the people who are going to make the world different. In one of my books, we use the distinction between divas and knaves. And a diva, and we use the example of Steve Jobs, who clearly was a diva, opinionated and strong and argumentative and would bully people if he didn't like them, but was brilliant when he was a diva. He wanted perfection, right? Aligning yourself with Steve Jobs is a good idea. The alternative is what we call a knave. And a knave, which you know from British history, is somebody who's acting on their own account. They're not trying to do the right thing. They're trying to benefit themselves at the cost of others. And so if you can identify a person in one of these teams, they're just trying to solve the problem in a really clever way. And they're passionate about it and they want to do it. That's how the world moves forward. If you don't have such a person, your company's not going to go anywhere. And the reason is that it's too easy just to keep doing what you were doing, right? And innovation is fundamentally about changing what you're doing. Up until this generation of tech companies, most companies seem to me to be one-shot wonders. Right, they would have one thing that was very successful, and then it would it was typically follow an S-curve, and nothing much would happen. And now I think the people are smarter, people are better educated. You now see repeatable waves. A good example being Microsoft, which is an older company now, founded in basically 81, 82, something like that. So let's call that 45 years old. But they've reinvented themselves a number of times, right, in a really powerful way.
We should probably talk about this then before we move on, which is what you're talking about there is that sort of founder, things people now refer to as founder mode, that founder energy, that high conviction, that sort of disruptive thinking, and that ability to reinvent yourself. I was looking at some stats last night, in fact, and I was looking at how long companies stay on the S&P 500 on average now. And it went from 33 years to 17 years to 12 years average tenure. And as you play those numbers forward, eventually in sort of 2050, an AI told me that it would be about 8 years.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the founder mode argument. And the reason is that it's great to have a brilliant founder. And there's this, it's actually like more than great. It's like really important. And we need more brilliant founders. Universities are producing these people, by the way. They do exist and they show up every year.
For anyone that doesn't know who Larry and Sergey are and doesn't know that sort of early Google story, can you give me a little bit of that backstory, but then also introduce these characters called Larry and Sergey for anyone that doesn't know?
So Larry Page and Sergey Brin met at Stanford. They were on a grant from, believe it or not, the National Science Foundation as graduate students. And Larry Page invented a algorithm called PageRank, which is named after him. And he and Sergey wrote a paper, which is still one of the most cited papers in the world. And it's essentially a way of understanding priority of information. And mathematically, it was a Fourier transform of the way people normally did things at the time. And so they wrote this code. I don't think they were that good a set of programmers. They sort of plugged it in, and they had their data center in the bedroom, in the dorm. Classic story. And then they moved to a building that was owned by the sister of a girlfriend at the time. And that's how they founded the company. Their first investor was one of the founder of Sun Microsystem, whose name was Andy Bechtolsheim, who just said, "I'll just give you the money because you're obviously incredibly smart."
How much did he give them?
$100,000, or maybe maybe it was $1 million. But in any case, it ultimately became many billions of dollars. So it gives you a sense of this early founding is very important. So the founders then set up in this little Google world headquarters in Neon Made, and they had a big headquarters with the 4 employees that were sitting below them and the computer that Larry and Sergey had built. Larry and Sergey were very, very good software people and obviously brilliant, but they were not very good hardware. And so they built the computers using corkboard to separate the CPUs. And if you know anything about hardware generates a lot of heat, and the corkboard would catch on fire. So eventually, when I showed up, we started building proper hardware with proper hardware engineers. But it gives you a sense of the scrappiness that was so characteristic. And today there are people of enormous impact on society. And I think that will continue for many, many years.
Why did they call you in, and at what point did they realize that they needed someone like you? Need you in the future?
Yeah. So one of the things about Larry and Sergey is that they thought for the long term. So they didn't say Google would be a search company. They said the mission of Google is to organize all the world's information. Now, if you think about it, that's pretty audacious 25 years ago. Like, how are you going to do that? And so they started with web search. Eventually, and Larry had studied AI quite extensively, and he began to work, and ultimately he acquired, with all of us, obviously, this company called DeepMind here in Britain, which essentially is the first company to really see the AI opportunity. And pretty much all of the things you've seen from AI in the last decade have come from people who were either at DeepMind or competing with DeepMind.
Going back to this point about principles then, before we move further on, as it relates to building a great company, what are some of those founding principles? We have lots of entrepreneurs that listen to the show. One of them you've expressed is this need for the divas, I guess, these people who are just very high conviction and can kind of see into the future. What are the other principles that I need to be thinking about when I'm scaling my company?
Well, the first is to think about scale. I think a current example is look at Elon. Elon is an incredible entrepreneur and an incredible scientist. And if you study how he operates, he gets people by, I think, sheer force of personal will to overperform, to take huge risks, which somehow he has this brilliance where he can make those trade-offs and get it right. So these are exceptional people. Now, in our book with Genesis, we argue that you're going to have that in your pocket. But as to whether you'll have the judgment to take the risks that Elon does, that's another question. One of the other ways to think about it is an awful lot of people talk to me about the companies that they're founding, and they're a little widget. Like, I want to make the camera better, or I want to make the dress better, or I want to make book publishing cheaper, or so forth. These are all fine ideas. I'm interested in ideas which have the benefit of scale. And when I say scale, I mean the ability to go from 0 to infinity in terms of the number of users and demand and scale. There are plenty of ways of thinking about this, but what would be such a company in the age of AI? Well, we can tell you what it would look like. It would have apps, one on Android, one on iOS, maybe a few others. Those apps will use powerful networks, and they'll have a really big computer in the back that's doing AI calculations. So future successful companies will all have that, right? Exactly what problem it solves, well, that's up to the founder. But if you're not using AI at every aspect of your business, you're not going to make it. And the distinction as a programming matter is that when I was doing all of this way back when, you had to write the code. Now AI has to discover the answer. Mm-hmm. It's a very big deal. And of course, a lot of this was invented at Google, 10 years ago. But basically, all of a sudden, analytical programming, which is sort of what I did my whole life, writing code and, do this, do that, add this, subtract this, call this, so forth and so on, is gradually being replaced by learning the answer, right? So, for example, we use the example of language translation. The current large language models are essentially organized around predicting the next word. Well, if you can predict the next word, you can predict the next sequence in biology. You can predict the next action. You can predict the next thing the robot should do. So all of this stuff around large language models and deep learning, it has come out. The Transformer paper, GPT-3, ChatGPT, which for most people was this huge moment, is essentially about predicting the next word and getting it right.
In terms of company culture and how important that is for the success and prospects of a company, well, how do you think about company culture and how significant and important is it? And like when and who sets it?
So it's almost always set, company cultures are almost always set by the founders. I happen to be on the board of the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic is the largest healthcare system in America. It's also the most highly rated one. And they have a rule which is called the needs of the customer come first, which came out of the Mayo brothers who've been dead for like 120 years. But that was their principle. And when I initially got on the board, I started wandering around. I thought, this is kind of a stupid phrase, and nobody really does this. And they really believe it, and they repeat it, and they repeat it, right? So it's true in non-technical cultures. In that case, it's a healthcare for service delivery. You can drive a culture even in non-tech. In tech, it's typically an engineering culture. And if I had to do things over again, I would have even more technical people and even fewer non-technical people, and just make the technical people figure out what they have to do. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry for that bias, because I'm not trying to offend anybody. But the fact of the matter is, the technical people, if you build the right product, your customers will come. If you don't build the right product, then you don't need a sales force. Why are you selling an inferior product? Mm-hmm. So in the How Google Works book, and ultimately in the $1 Trillion Coach book, which is about Bill Campbell, we talked a lot about how the CEO is now the chief product officer, the chief innovation officer, because 50 years ago, you didn't have access to capital, you didn't have access to marketing, you didn't have access to sales, you didn't have access to distribution hours. I was meeting today with an entrepreneur who said, we'll be 95% technical. And I said, why? I said, well, we have a contract manufacturer, and our products are so good that people will just buy them. This happened to be a technical switching company. And they said it's only 100,000 times better than its competitors. And I said, it will sell. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it doesn't work yet.
Yeah.
It isn't the point. But if they achieve their goal, people will be lined up outside the door. So as a matter of culture, you want to build a technical culture with values about getting the product to work, right? And working is not another thing you do with engineers, is you say, they make a nice presentation to you and they go, I said, that's very interesting. But I'm not your customer. Your customer is really tough, because your customers wants everything to work and free and work right now and never make any mistakes. So give me their feedback. And if their feedback is good, I love you. Mm-hmm. And if their feedback is bad, then you better get back to work and stop being so arrogant. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that in the invention process within firms, people fall in love with an idea and they don't test it. One of the things that Google did, and this was largely Marissa Mayer, way back when, is one day she said to me, I don't know how to judge user interface.
Marissa Mayer was the previous CEO.
She was the CEO of Yahoo, and before that, she ran all the consumer products at Google. And she's now running another company in the Bay Area. But the important thing about Marissa is she said, I said, well, the UI, the user interface is great at the time, and it certainly was. And she said, I don't know how to judge the user interface myself, and none of my team do. But we know how to measure. And so what she organized were A/B tests. You test one, test another. So remember that it's possible using these networks to actually kind of figure out, because they're highly instrumented, dwell time. How long does somebody watch this? How important it is. If you go back to how TikTok works, one of the signals that they use include the amount of time you watch, commenting, forwarding, sharing, all of those kinds of things. And those, you can understand those as analytics that go into an AI engine that makes a decision as to what to do next, what to make viral.
And on this point of culture at scale, is it right to expect that the culture changes as the company scales? Because you came into Google, I believe, when they were doing sort of $100 million in revenue, and you left when they were doing, what was it, 180 billion or something? Staggering.
Yeah.
But is it right to assume that the culture of a growing company should scale from when there was 10 people in that garage to when there's 100?
So when I go back to Google to visit, and they were kind enough to give me a badge and treat me well, of course, I hear the echoes of this. I was at a lunch where there was a lady running search and a gentleman running ads, the successors to the people who worked with me. And I asked them, what's it going? And they said the same problems. The same problems have not been solved, but they're much bigger. And so when you go to a company, I suspect, I was not near the founding of Apple, but I was on the board for a while. The founding culture you can see today in their obsession about user interfaces, their obsession about being closed and their privacy and secrecy. It's just a different company, right? I'm not passing judgment. Setting the culture is important. The echoes are there. What does happen in big companies is they become less efficient for many reasons. The first thing that happens is they become conservative because of they're public and they have lawsuits. And a famous example is that Microsoft, after the antitrust case in the 90s, became so conservative in terms of what it could launch that it really missed the web revolution for a long time. They have since recovered. And I, of course, was happy to exploit that as a competitor to them when we were at Google. But the important thing is, when big companies should be faster because they have more money and more scale, they should be able to do things even quicker. But in my industry anyway, the tech startups that have a new, clear idea tend to win because the big company can't move fast enough to do it. Another example, we had built something called Google Video. I was very proud of Google Video. And David Drummond, who was the general counsel at the time, came in and said, you have to look at this YouTube people. I said, like, why? Right? Who cares? And it turns out they're really good and they're more clever than your team. And I said, that can't be true. Typical arrogant Eric. And we sat down and we looked at it and they really were quicker, even though we had an incumbent. And why? It turns out that the incumbent was operating under the traditional rules that Google had, which was fine. And the competitor, in this case YouTube, was not constrained by that. They could work at any pace and they could do all sorts of things, intellectual property and so forth. Ultimately, we were sued over all of that stuff, and we ultimately won all those suits. But it's an example where there are these moments in time where you have to move extremely quickly. You're seeing that right now with generative technology. So the AGI, the generative revolution, generate code, generate videos, generate text, generate everything. All of those winners are being determined in the next 6, 12 months. And then once the slope is set, once the growth rate is quadrupling every 6 months or so forth, it's very hard for somebody else to come in. So it's a race to get there as fast as you can. So when you talk to the great venture capitalists, they're fast, right? We'll look at it, we'll make a decision tomorrow, we're done, we're in, and so forth. And we want to be first, because that's where they make the most amount of money.
So we were talking before you arrived, I was talking to Jack about this idea of like harvesting and hunting. So harvesting what you've already sowed and hunting for new opportunities. But I've always found it's quite difficult to get the harvesters to be the hunters at the same time.
So harvesting and hunting is a good metaphor. I'm interested in entrepreneurs. And so what we learned at Google was ultimately, if you want to get something done, you have to have somebody who's entrepreneurial in their approach, in charge of a small business. And so, for example, Sundar, when he became CEO, had a model of which were the little things that he was going to emphasize and which were the big things. Some of those little things are now big things, right? And he managed it that way. So one way to understand innovation in a large company is you need to know who the owner is. Larry Page would say over and over again, it's not going to happen unless there's an owner who's going to drive this. And he was supremely good at identifying that technical talent, right? That's one of his great founder strengths. So when you talk about founders, not only do you have to have a vision, but you also have to have either great luck or great skill as to who is the person who can lead this. Inevitably, those people are highly technical in the sense that they can, and very quick moving, and they have good management skills, right? They understand how to hire people and deploy resources. That allows for innovation. Most of the, if I look back in my career, each generation of the tech companies failed, including, for example, Sun, at the point at which it became non-competitive with the future.
Is it possible for a team to innovate while they still have their day job, which is harvesting, if you know what I mean? Or do you have to take those people, put them into a different team, different building, different P&L, and get them to focus